Days after the death of Betty Broderick, we're learning more about her failed bids for freedom and her mental outlook inside prison, partly revealed.
And I had no plan. I just wanted to just die. That's it. That's the end of the story.
They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And it feels like whoever came up with that phrase had met Betty Broderick first. For over 3 decades, Betty Broderick sat inside a California prison cell, convicted of fatally shooting her ex-husband, Daniel T. Broderick III, and his new wife, Linda Kolkena Broderick, in the early hours of November 5, 1989. The world had already decided who she was, a jealous, scorned woman who couldn't let go. But before she died on May 8, 2026, at age 78, Betty Broderick had something left to say. And what she said changes everything you thought you knew about this case. Who was Betty Broderick before the murders? To understand what Betty Broderick said before she died, you have to understand who she was before the world reduced her to a headline. Elizabeth Ann Bishalia was born on November 7, 1947, in New York. She was raised Catholic, came from a large family, and by all accounts was bright, driven, and ambitious.
I was one of 6 children, and we all went to Catholic schools all the way through. I went to Immaculate Conception first.
A woman who believed in doing everything the right way. She attended Mount St. Vincent College on a scholarship, and it was there, in the late 1960s, that she met Daniel T. Broderick III. Dan Broderick was charming, ambitious, and had a clear vision for his future. He wanted to be a doctor and a lawyer. He would become both. Betty believed in him completely. She worked multiple jobs to help put him through Cornell Medical School and then Harvard Law School. She raised their children, managed the household, moved the family from city to city as his career required, and built the social life that a man in his position was expected to have. She was, by every measure, a devoted partner, investing everything she had into a shared future. By the early 1980s, that investment appeared to have paid off. The Brodericks were living in La Jolla, California. Dan was a highly successful medical malpractice attorney, one of the best in San Diego. They had 4 children, a sprawling home, country club memberships, luxury vacations. From the outside, theirs was the picture-perfect life. But behind that picture, something was already cracking. Betty would later describe feeling increasingly invisible in her own marriage. Not a partner, but a prop. She watched Dan receive praise and recognition for a life she had helped build from the ground up, while her own contributions were treated as invisible. When Dan began hiring a young woman named Linda Kolkena as his assistant in 1983, Betty's instincts told her something was wrong. She raised it. Dan dismissed her, repeatedly, for years. This is the context that Betty Broderick spent the rest of her life trying to make people understand. Not as an excuse, as an explanation. But what happens when the man you built everything for decides he wants a different life and uses everything you helped him build to make sure you walk away with nothing? The divorce that destroyed her. The formal unraveling began in 1985 when Dan Broderick filed for divorce. What followed was not a clean legal separation. It was, by Betty's account, a systematic dismantling of her life carried out by a man who knew exactly how to use the legal system as a weapon. Dan was a lawyer, one of the best in his field. He understood procedure, deadlines, filings, and leverage. Betty did not, and according to her, he used that imbalance deliberately and mercilessly. Right now, some people who revisited the case argued that the public had oversimplified Betty Broderick's motives. A local real estate broker who reviewed public records and reportedly corresponded with Betty between 2022 and 2023 concluded that the collapse of the marriage wasn't just about infidelity. According to that assessment, the fight over money, property, and financial control may have been just as central to the conflict as Dan's relationship with Linda. In other words, this wasn't only a story about betrayal, it was also a story about power, assets, and what happens when one person controls nearly all of both. She described being denied adequate financial support while he controlled the marital assets. She described being frozen out of decisions about their children. She described a prolonged custody battle that she experienced not as a legal dispute between two equals, but as an act of war waged by someone who had the tools and the connections to make sure she would lose. During this period, Betty's behavior became erratic and, at times, genuinely destructive. She rammed her car into Dan's front door. She left profanity-laced messages on his answering machine. She vandalized his property. She was held in contempt of court multiple times. These actions were real, documented, and used extensively against her, both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. But Betty consistently argued that these weren't the actions of a woman driven by jealousy or instability alone. They were the actions of a woman who had been pushed to the edge by a system that refused to see her as a victim of anything. Every time she acted out, she said it was because she had tried every legitimate avenue first and found them all closed to her. Dan and Linda married in April 1989. Betty received notice of the wedding the same day it happened. 6 months later, she walked into their bedroom with a gun. So after years of financial warfare, public humiliation, and a system that seemed designed to work against her, what did a jury actually do with all of that? The trials and the verdict. The public loved to debate. Betty Broderick was tried twice for taking the lives of Daniel and Linda Broderick. The first trial ended in a hung jury in 1990, an outcome that surprised many and infuriated just as many others. 5 jurors voted to convict on first-degree murder. 1 voted for involuntary manslaughter. The remaining jurors landed somewhere in between. The split reflected what would become the defining tension of this case for decades. Was Betty Broderick a cold-blooded killer? Or was she a woman broken by years of abuse who finally snapped? The second trial in 1991 delivered a verdict. Betty was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She would become eligible for parole. She would be denied it, repeatedly. Over the years, Betty's case became something of a cultural flashpoint. 2 television movies dramatized her story. True crime writers dissected it. She gave jailhouse interviews. She wrote letters. She called in to radio shows. She was angry, sharp, sometimes irrational, sometimes startlingly lucid, and always utterly convinced that she had been wronged. Not just by Daniel, but by the entire legal and social system that had processed her case. For some, her inability to express remorse was evidence of her guilt and her danger. For others, it was evidence of something more complicated. A woman who genuinely believed, on some foundational level, that she had been the victim, even as she acknowledged pulling the trigger. 2 trials, 1 conviction, and decades behind bars. But what did Betty Broderick actually say about the man at the center of it all? And did she ever tell the full truth before she died? What she said about Daniel before she died. This is the part that matters most, and it's the part that has received far less attention than it deserves. Before she died, Betty Broderick did not give a new formal public interview. By the time of her death on May 8, 2026, she was reportedly on life support and unable to speak. But she had already broken her silence in writing. In a letter sent to the producers of the documentary series Murder Made Me Famous, Betty described Daniel Broderick in terms that went far beyond the jealous ex-wife narrative. She called him the source of what she described as emotional terrorism. She accused him of subjecting her to a sustained pattern of coercive control throughout their marriage, not just in the divorce proceedings, but in the years before, during the period when, from the outside, everything looked fine. Coercive control is a term that has gained significant recognition in domestic violence discourse over the past 2 decades. It refers to a pattern of behavior used to take away the victim's liberty or freedom and strip away their sense of self. It includes isolation, degradation, monitoring, and the deliberate exploitation of systems, legal, financial, social, to maintain dominance. It doesn't require physical violence, though it often coexists with it. Betty's framing was deliberate. She wasn't just venting. She was making a legal and moral argument, one that she had been trying to make since the early 1990s. That her case was not a murder case with a domestic backdrop, but a domestic violence case that ended in deaths, and that the distinction mattered enormously. In the same letter, she wrote that she had no one to speak for me. Those words carry a particular weight. She wasn't referring only to the moment of the crime. She was referring to the entirety of the divorce, the court proceedings, the custody battle, the years of isolation and humiliation that she said preceded the killings. She felt and said that the story had always been told by people with power and access, and that her version had been systematically dismissed. She described the prolonged divorce and custody battle as a period in which she was left feeling trapped and abused, not by physical force, but by the calculated use of legal, financial, and social leverage wielded by someone who knew exactly how every system worked and how to make it work against her. Whether you believe her account entirely, partially, or not at all, the letter represented something important. The clearest and most structured articulation she ever gave of what she believed had happened to her, framed not in the language of heartbreak or jealousy, but in the language of documented abuse patterns. If she truly believed she was the victim, why couldn't she just say the right things to a parole board and walk free? And what did she mean when she called herself a political prisoner? The parole denials and her claim of being a political prisoner.
Betty Broderick became eligible for parole in 2010. She was denied. She went back. She was denied again, and again, and again.
By the time of her death, she had been denied parole multiple times over more than a decade. Each denial was, for her supporters, further evidence that the system was punishing her not for being dangerous. She was an elderly woman with no history of violence outside the 1989 killings, but for refusing to perform the kind of remorse that parole boards expect. Betty was never good at performing remorse. She could acknowledge that the killings had happened. She could acknowledge that they had caused deep pain to her children and to Linda's family, but she could not, or would not, stand before a parole board and frame herself as simply a violent woman who had done an unforgivable thing, because that framing, in her mind, left out everything that had led to that morning. In the same letter that her final statements came from, Betty used a phrase that made headlines. She called herself a political prisoner. She argued that there was no legitimate public safety reason to continue denying her parole after decades of incarceration. She was elderly, her health was declining, and the statistical likelihood of her posing any threat to anyone was essentially zero. The political prisoner framing was provocative, and it was meant to be. She wasn't comparing herself to dissidents imprisoned for their beliefs in the traditional sense. She was making a narrower, more specific argument that her continued imprisonment had become about politics, about what her freedom would symbolize, about the message it might send, rather than about justice or safety. It's worth noting that this is not an uncommon argument among long-term prisoners who have aged significantly behind bars. The question of when punishment has been served and what the prison system is actually accomplishing by continuing to hold an elderly, non-threatening individual is a genuine and serious one that criminal justice reformers grapple with across many cases. Betty's framing of it in these terms was consistent with the way she had always approached her situation, not as someone asking for mercy, but as someone demanding recognition that the system had gotten it wrong. She died waiting for that recognition. She never got it. But beyond Betty's own words, what does the actual record show? And what do the children caught in the middle of all of this have to say about who their parents really were? Her legacy, her children, and what the record shows. Betty Broderick left behind 4 children: Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett. Their relationship with their mother was, understandably, complicated. They lost their father and their stepmother in a single violent morning in 1989. They also lost their mother, first to the legal system, then to prison, and then to death. Her son Daniel confirmed details of her passing and spoke about her final days. He described a woman who had been on life support before she died, and who, in her last weeks, was no longer able to communicate. The written statements she left behind, including the letter to the documentary producers, were among the last direct explanations she ever gave of her relationship with his father and the reasons she believed the violent act had happened. What does the public record actually show about Daniel Broderick and the divorce proceedings? It shows that the divorce was prolonged, contentious, and that Betty was held in contempt of court multiple times for her behavior. It shows that she was represented by attorneys who were repeatedly frustrated by her refusal to follow legal advice. It shows that Dan Broderick was a wealthy and well-connected attorney who had significant advantages in navigating the legal process. It does not show a straightforward villain and a straightforward victim. It shows 2 people in a catastrophic collapse, one of whom had far more institutional power than the other, and one of whom eventually did something for which there is no legal justification. The domestic violence community has, in the years since Betty's case first became widely known, increasingly pointed to it as an early and under-recognized example of coercive control, not to justify the violent acts, but to argue that understanding what led to them matters, both for accurately reckoning with what happened and for building legal and social systems that might prevent similar outcomes. Betty's own account, as laid out in her final letter and in decades of prior statements, was always consistent. She had been a victim before she became a perpetrator. She always insisted that the case had to be understood as a whole, not as a single violent morning stripped of context. Whether history will ultimately agree with her framing is an open question. But the fact that she died, having never received parole, having never been publicly acknowledged as anything other than a killer, having never had her account of coercive control formally recognized by any court, that is also part of the record. So after everything, the trials, the denials, the decades of silence and noise, what do Betty Broderick's very last words actually reveal about the man she killed and the marriage that led there? What her final words reveal about the Broderick case? There's something significant about the fact that Betty Broderick's final statements came in the form of a letter to documentary filmmakers, not in a courtroom, not in a parole hearing, not in a formal interview. It suggests something about who she believed was actually capable of hearing her, not the legal system, which had repeatedly dismissed her framing of events, not the parole board, which had repeatedly rejected her case, but an audience, people who might sit with her story, wrestle with it, and possibly arrive at a more complicated understanding than jealous ex-wife commits murder. In those final written words, she described a marriage defined by emotional terrorism and coercive control. She described a divorce process weaponized against her. She described herself as a woman with no voice and no advocate in a system stacked against her. And she described her continued imprisonment as political rather than just. By the end of her life, Betty continued insisting that the public had misunderstood the core of the conflict, not just adultery, but financial domination, asset battles, and the feeling that the life she helped build had been taken from her piece by piece. None of this erases the fact that 2 people died. Linda Kolkena Broderick was 28 years old. She was not the architect of Betty's suffering. She was a woman who fell in love with a man who was still married and paid for it with her life. Daniel Broderick's children lost their father. Whatever he did or didn't do in his marriage, he did not deserve to be shot in his bedroom. Betty Broderick knew all of this. What she insisted, until the very end, was that knowing all of it still wasn't the same as understanding all of it, and that understanding required reckoning with what came before the gun. Her final statements were not a confession in the traditional sense, they were not an apology, and they were not a retraction. They were an insistence, one last time before she ran out of time entirely, that her story had not been told truthfully, and that Daniel Broderick was not the man the world had been allowed to see. Whether you believe her is a decision every person gets to make for themselves, but she made sure, before she died, that you couldn't say you hadn't heard her. Betty Broderick died on May 8, 2026, inside the California Institution for Women, never having received parole, never having been publicly recognized as a survivor of coercive control, and never having seen her version of events formally acknowledged by the system that imprisoned her. Her final written statements are the closest thing the world has to a deathbed confession, not of guilt, which she never denied, but of context, which she spent 30 years fighting to establish. This case has never been simple, and if you've made it this far, you already know that. If this video gave you something to think about, drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Betty Broderick a domestic violence victim who crossed a line no one should ever cross? Or was she something else entirely? The conversation has been going for 30 years. It didn't end with her. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next.